Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Luke chapter 16 as we are getting ready to study the parable of the unjust steward. Now, when I was preparing for this sermon, one of the things that I noticed as I was reading through a book was that there are a lot of interpretations about this parable. There's a lot of people who say a lot of different things, and one of the points the author made was that this is one of the most difficult parables because so many people think it means so many different things. But as I was reading through the list, and people said, oh, this shows us this aspect, and here God is wanting us to learn this. One of the things that I noticed is that all these people were making the same mistake. They were trying to make this parable a one-to-one comparison. They were trying to say, okay, here is God, here is the church, here is man, here is the world, and they were trying to fit everything in neatly. And I told you when we first began this study several weeks ago that not every parable does that. Not everything in the parables has a direct correlation. And this is a perfect example of that. In fact, if you look at Luke chapter 16, one of the first things I want to point out before we even read our text is that the rich man is not God, and that the manager is not us. We want to make sure we don't make the same mistake that so many do in trying to force God into this position where then you look at later on in the parable and you go, well, wow, God's doing this crazy stuff. So let's go ahead and go to our text. Let's read Luke chapter 16. We're going to start in verse 1 and we're going to read all the way to verse 13. And then as we usually do, we're going to break down the parable and we'll show what this parable is meant to teach us. Luke chapter 16, verse 1. He also said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me in their houses. So summoning his master's debtors, one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe, my master? He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, and how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give to you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. This is, again, a difficult parable, but it's only difficult if we try to mislabel people. If we try to say, hey, this is God, this is man, and we really try to stress points that the text just doesn't make. In fact, Jesus tells us what he means by this parable. Starting in verse 10, he actually lays out the application of what he's saying. So let's go through this. Let's start in verse 1 and let's see what Jesus is teaching, what he wants us to know from the parable of the unjust steward. When you look through, and you can go back to verse 1, again, I'm reading out of the ESV, so if you're studying along with the King James or the New King James, the wording will be a little bit different. But when you start reading, you'll notice that it says, the rich man who had a manager, charges were brought to him. Basically, this rich man, he is someone who has hired someone to take care of his estate. Think of Pharaoh and Joseph. Think of some of these other individuals. Today we have people that are so wealthy, they need someone to handle the day-to-day of their estate. I'm reminded of the Iron Man movie when Tony Stark is, telling Pepper Potts that he doesn't need her, and she looks at him and she says, what's your social security number? Do you even know your own social security number? And he listed off, 2 numbers, and she's like, okay, well, you got part of it. These are people that are so wealthy that they can't even begin to manage things themselves. And this rich man, he has a manager, and someone has come to him and told him, hey, your manager is wasting your goods. They're not doing their job. So the manager, he calls the rich man, he calls his manager to him, and he says, hey, this is what I've heard. Give me the books. Let me look and see. Let me see what you're doing, because I've heard that you're wasting my wealth, and you're done. So he has a little bit of time. You read in verse 3 that the manager says to himself, what am I going to do? My master is taking the management away from me. He knows that he has a little bit of time. As you can go ahead and get the idea, the image in your head. The manager has handed over the books. The master is trying to read through them, trying to figure out, okay, what is all this? And, the manager says, okay, I'm in trouble. He goes, I'm not strong enough to dig. In other words, I'm not fit for physical labor. And I have too much pride. I'm not going to go beg on the street. So what am I going to do? And he goes, aha, I'm dishonest anyway. Remember that. Remember that about this man. He's dishonest. The whole reason he's being fired is because he's wasting his master's money. Excuse me. So he calls in those who owe his master a debt. We get 2 different individuals he calls in. One that owes, 100 measures of oil, and one that owes 100 measures of wheat. Now, my Bible has this translated as being 875 gallons of oil and 1,000 to 1,200 bushels of wheat. So we're not talking about a small debt. We're talking about a massive debt. This is something that, your average person couldn't pay. They owe a large amount of money. They're really in trouble themselves, more than likely. And he looks at him and he says, hey, here's what I want you to do. That debt you owe? I want you to write 50. This is what he tells the man who owes him 100 measures of oil. He says, I want you to write 50 of it and then consider your debt paid. So he basically is stealing from his master. He is stealing from him, and he is writing off a massive amount of debt while he still has the authority. In fact, look at verse 6. It says, near the end of it, he says, sit down quickly and write 50. He says, don't delay. Don't do anything else. Don't think about it. Sit down, do it right now. Showing that he's, again, being dishonest. He's stealing, he's lying, he's cheating his master out of more of his master's goods. But he's doing it because, as he said in verse 4, I've decided, the King James says, I am resolved what to do. He's saying, look, I figured it out. I'm going to steal some more from my master. I'm going to go ahead and go to these people, and I'm going to write off this massive amount of debt, 50 for the man with oil, and he writes off 20 for the man with wheat. And he says, I'm going to excuse me again, sorry. He says, I'm going to write off this part of the debt, and they're going to remember me. They're going to remember that I did this favor for them, so that when I'm kicked out, I can go crash at their house. I can go ahead and stay there for a little while because they'll have owed me for taking care of this debt. Now, verse 8 is where people get hung up a lot, because they have made God be the rich man. They've made the manager be themselves. And then they get to verse 8 and it says, the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. And they go, wow, God's going to commend me for being dishonest? But that's not what's happening. Again, remember, God is not the rich man here. God is not this master. The master is simply a master of a man who lives in the world. The master looks at his servant and he says, you prepared. He's not saying good job for stealing from me. God is not saying in this parable, Jesus is not teaching that it is acceptable to steal from your master. He's not teaching that it's an acceptable thing to cheat your boss of what is owed to him. In fact, he tells us exactly what he finds commendable and why he's teaching this. In verse 8, we read it again. It says, "The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light." Now look at what Jesus says. Okay, so he says, the master commended him for his ability to take care of himself. Go back to verse 4. I've decided I'm going to provide for myself. I'm fixing to lose my job. Things are fixing to get really bad. So I've decided here's how I'm going to provide and take care of myself in the morrow. Verse 8, the master commends him for that mentality, taking care of, preparing for the morrow, preparing for what's to come in the future. Verse 9 says, "And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth." Now, 1 Timothy 6:10 tells us the love of money is the root of all evil. The love of money. Now, money itself is not evil. In fact, it's kind of interesting that, when talking about this, Jesus says, make friends of yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth. Money in itself is not evil, but it is the source of so much evil. You look at our world, look at the situation we find ourselves in, most every problem we have revolves around money. I've seen marriages collapse because of money. In fact, that if you look at our divorce rates, a lot of it is because they had a disagreement on finances. That's a lot of the problems we face. Money gets in between everything. So you see this, and you see, God is telling them basically. Jesus makes the point. He says, "Make friends for yourselves by means of the unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings." Now, what this is actually saying, the eternal dwellings is heaven. He says, make friends, or use your money, use this unrighteous wealth, use the things of the world for good. Show benevolence towards your fellow man. Do what you can. Use them properly. Be a good steward. We'll get to that. We'll really see that that's what he's talking about starting in verse 10. Be a good steward of the things of the world, even the, unrighteous wealth. Use the money that God has blessed you with. We've often heard people say things like, if I just had, this much money, or if I had just that much money, I would do so much more for the church. And, I often wonder, would you really? Because it's easy to say that, but it's a lot harder to actually do it. I'm as guilty as anyone. You get a raise at work and you go, oh, hey, I got a raise here. I really need to do a little bit more. And then, you start thinking about it. You start looking around and go, how I can do this. And suddenly that new-minded idea of increasing your benevolence is, the money's gone. So we see people, they say, hey, I'll do this. If I just had a little bit more, if God would just bless me with a little bit more, I would do a little bit more. But are we actually using what God has given to us? Are we actually making good use of the blessings God has given us? Are we using God's blessings properly? Verse 9 again says, "And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth. Show benevolence. Use God's wealth that he has blessed you with, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings." Now, starting in verse 10, Jesus makes application. He has given them the parable. He has given them a command. Make friends with unrighteous wealth. Now he's going to go ahead and give some application as to what he means, why he's telling them these things. He says, "One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. Now, let's go ahead and look at this and let's consider what he's talking about here. We realize that the little has to be the world, has to be the things of the world. So the very little is the physical. If we are faithful in the physical, then Jesus says if you're faithful with these physical things, the unrighteous wealth, then you'll be faithful in much. Now, what could that be? Well, if the physical matters are little, what could be the big? Well, obviously it's the gospel. Jesus says if we show that we are faithful towards God, because that's what faithfulness is, that's the idea here. If we are faithful in our application of God's blessings in these physical matters, well then, when God grants us the gospel, when we have the gospel to share with others, when we have God's gift of life eternal, we'll be faithful in that as well. But the same is true as well. If I am cheating God of what he is due, if I am not properly using the physical blessings, then when it comes to matters of spiritual things, why would I think I'd be faithful to God there? If I can't even use the little properly, then there's no way I'll use the big, the much properly. He continues on in verse 11. He says, if then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, see, making that comparison, the unrighteous wealth is the little, who will entrust you to true riches? And if you've not been in, verse 12, if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give to you that which is your own? Now, we need to take a moment to stop and to realize that God owns everything. The unrighteous wealth, the little, that belongs to God. Psalm chapter 24, verse 1 lets us know, it reminds us that the world belongs to God. You go to Genesis 1:1, he says, in the beginning God created the world. It actually says the heavens and the earth, but the idea being here, quite simply, that God created it, God maintains it, God controls it. It is God's. So, look at this concept. Remember that God is the ruler of this earth. It belongs to him. So if we're not faithful in that which belongs to God, well, Jesus told his disciples that he's coming back to give them a mansion, to take them with him. We're told that, God has given to us life eternal, that we're blessed with great spiritual blessings. Jesus tells us to lay our treasure up in heaven. We have all these ideas, all these concepts of our treasure, our riches, true wealth, true riches, being that which we get in the hereafter. If we're not faithful with the physical, with the life we've been blessed with, if we're not faithful with sharing the gospel, with providing and taking care of the physical needs of others, if we're not faithful with God's earth, who will give to you that which is your own? If God can't even trust us in the here and now, why do we think he would say, okay, well done, thy good and faithful servant? If we're not good, if we're not faithful, if we're not actually serving him, why would he give us more? He ends it with the idea that no servant can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Matthew 6:33, seek ye first the kingdom of God. Jesus makes it abundantly clear. Every time we look through the Bible, every time we study and we look at what God wants us to do, the greatest command, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. God comes first. In our life, in the use of the little, we have to make sure we're faithfully serving God. To go ahead and bring this all together, in Luke chapter 16, what we find is that an unfaithful, unjust, sinful man is commended not for the act of being sinful, but for the reality that he took care, he prepared for tomorrow. And the question that Jesus asks is, are we doing the same? Are we using what God has blessed us with? Are we making sure that we're preparing ourselves for tomorrow? And the only way we can do that is by being good stewards, by trusting and seeking God first. We can't serve ourselves and God. We can't serve mammon and God. We can't serve money and God. This afternoon, are you putting God first? Or are you putting yourself first like the unjust steward? Thank you.